Salt crystals coated every surface in Bitter Creek as dawn cracked gray and hostile over the Wyoming territory. The February cold bit through wool and leather like broken glass, each breath a knife in the lungs. Through her cabin's ice-webbed window, Lena Grayhawk watched 20 horsemen materialize from the crystalline haze, like death itself, given form their torches' burning orange wounds in the silver morning. Elias Brand rode point on his black stallion gaunt frame, wrapped in a buffalo coat that couldn't warm the ice that had settled permanently in his chest. 3 weeks since his boy Marcus died, and grief had carved him hollow as a rotted tree. Behind him rode the town's men ranchers, whose cattle had frozen in the early winter, shopkeepers, whose shelves sat mysteriously empty, farmers, whose children lay buried in ground too hard to properly dig. Their faces were masked by frost-stiffened scarves, but rifle barrels caught the pale light like accusing fingers pointed at judgment itself. Lena Grayhawk. Brand's voice split the morning silence like an axe through seasoned timber. Come out of that den of evil, come face judgment for your crimes against God's innocent children. Inside the one-room cabin that had sheltered her since childhood, 10-year-old Will burned with fever on his narrow cot, breath rattling like dice in a leather cup. His face was pale as fresh snow, except for the bright red spots of fever on his sunken cheeks. One of 12 children currently struck down by the mysterious sickness that had already claimed 8 young lives in Bitter Creek, including Brand's own beloved son Marcus, just 3 weeks past. Will's green eyes, perfect mirrors of Lena's own. The only inheritance from their shared white father, were glass-bright with delirium as he reached toward her with trembling fingers. The cabin door exploded inward under the assault of rifle butts and iron-toed boots. Men poured through the opening like flood water breaking through a winter dam, their heavy breathing creating clouds of vapor that rose toward the low ceiling like incense from some primitive altar. Their boots crushed the dried herbs scattered across her floor chamomile, for calming the stomach willow bark, for bringing down fever echinacea, for strengthening the body's defenses against disease. These were medicines that represented her only means of helping the sick in a community that viewed her mixed Cheyenne heritage with suspicion barely concealed behind polite frontier manners. The temperature in the small room plummeted as Arctic air rushed through the shattered doorway, making Will whimper and curl deeper into his threadbare blankets, like a wounded animal seeking warmth that no longer existed in his world. Ruth Banner fought her way through the crowd of armed men, her worn leather medical bag pressed against her chest like a piece of battle armor. The 60-year-old midwife's silver hair hung wild and uncombed from the morning wind, and her usually gentle face was twisted with an outrage that made her look years younger and infinitely more dangerous than her age would suggest. Animals. She shouted, her voice cracking with age and fury as she tried to push past men twice her size. This child has been nursing the sick day and night for weeks, not cursing them. She's saved more lives in this godforsaken town than the rest of you combined. Pete Morse, Brand's foreman and chief lieutenant for the past 5 years, struck Ruth across the face with the back of his gloved hand. The blow sent her stumbling backward into the cabin wall with enough force to rattle her old bones and leave a red mark across her weathered cheek. Her medical bag burst open on impact, sending glass bottles and precious herbs scattering across the rough plank floor in a constellation of broken hopes and shattered remedies. "Shut your lying mouth, old witch!" Morse snarled his words, coming out in puffs of white vapor. "Or you'll burn right alongside her when the sun reaches its peak." But even as he delivered the threat, something flickered in Pete Morse's dark eyes, a hesitation, a moment of doubt that hadn't been there when they'd first gathered in the pre-dawn darkness to plan this execution. It was brief as a hummingbird's wing beat, but it spoke to some corner of his conscience that wasn't entirely dead. Rough hands seized Lena's arms with iron-gripped fingers digging into her flesh, through the thin cotton of her dress as they dragged her bodily away from Will's bedside. The boy reached out with fever-weak fingers, calling her name in a voice barely above a whisper. but she was already being hauled toward the door by men who saw her as something less than human. They bound her wrists with hemp rope that reeked of previous blood and other less identifiable stains rope that had been used before for similar purposes, already dark with the evidence of past victims who had knelt where she would soon kneel. The coarse fibers bit deep into her skin, drawing fresh blood that mixed with the older stains in a pattern that spoke of Bitter Creek's long and ugly history with frontier justice. The forced march from her cabin to the town square felt like walking the final steps to the gallows, with voices rising from every direction through the bitter morning air. "Witch!" Someone screamed from behind a frosted window. "Child killer!" cried another voice from the shadows between buildings. "Send the demon's spawn back to the hell that spawned her." The words struck like physical blows, each one driving home the absolute hopelessness of her situation and the depth of hatred that had been building against her in the weeks since the fever outbreak began claiming children with ruthless efficiency. By the time they reached the center of Bitter Creek, fully half of the town's 400 souls had gathered to witness the spectacle that Brand had promised them when he rode from house to house in the pre-dawn darkness, rousing men from their beds with promises of justice and an end to their suffering. Women clutched their surviving children close to their bodies while their eyes burned with the peculiar mixture of grief and bloodlust that comes from watching someone else pay for tragedies that seem to have no other rational explanation. Men fingered weapons and spoke in hushed, eager tones of cleansing fire and righteous judgment, their words creating clouds of vapor that rose toward the gray sky like prayers to some vengeful god. The salt crystals that had coated everything during the night were beginning to melt under the heat of the torches and the press of so many warm bodies, turning the hard ground into treacherous, slippery slush that reflected the orange flames like scattered drops of liquid fire. Brand's men had come prepared for theater as much as execution, understanding that spectacle was as important as justice in maintaining order on the frontier. They produced a crude wooden stake 8 feet tall and thick as a man's waist and began driving it deep into the partially frozen earth with sledgehammer blows that echoed off the surrounding buildings like the tolling of a funeral bell. Each impact sent vibrations through the ground that Lena could feel in her bones, a drumbeat countdown to her own death that grew steadily more ominous with every strike. When the stake was firmly planted, they nailed a hand-painted sign to its surface with iron spikes that screamed against the wood as they were driven home. Winter Witch died for her sins against God's children. The sign read in letters still wet with red paint that seemed to bleed in the flickering torchlight. The paint had obviously been applied recently, evidence that this execution had been planned and prepared long before any evidence was presented or defense was allowed. They forced Lena to her knees in the icy slush, directly in front of the stake, the cold and moisture soaking through her worn dress within seconds and chilling her to the bone marrow. Her knees found depressions in the mud that seemed worn smooth by previous victims, as if the very earth had been shaped by the weight of other innocents who had knelt in this same spot to face similar accusations. The thought sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the bitter cold. Citizens of Bitter Creek. Brand's voice carried across the assembled crowd like the crack of a bullwhip cutting through the murmur of conversation and the crackling of torches with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. Look upon the source of our suffering. Behold the cause of our children's deaths. This half-blood abomination has brought death and pestilence to our community through the dark magic that flows in her heathen veins like poison through a snake's fangs. From the rocky bluffs that surrounded Bitter Creek, like the walls of a natural amphitheater, Raven Elk watched the scene unfold through dark eyes that had witnessed far too much death and injustice in his 34 years of life on the frontier. The Cheyenne warrior had been tracking elk sign in the pre-dawn darkness, following the ancient hunting paths that his people had used for countless generations, before the white settlers came with their fences and their diseases and their insatiable hunger for land that belonged to no one and everyone. When he noticed the unusual gathering of lights in the valley below, curiosity had drawn him closer to investigate. Now seeing the young woman forced to kneel in the mud, while an angry mob bayed for her blood like a pack of wolves surrounding wounded prey, he felt the familiar rage building in his chest, like prairie fire racing before a summer storm. He recognized her instantly, despite the years that had passed since he'd last seen her as a child clinging to her mother's deerskin dress. She was the daughter of Singing Bird, a Cheyenne woman he had known and respected in his youth before the blue-coated soldiers came and scattered their people like leaves before a winter tornado. Singing Bird had been cast out by their own tribe for the crime of lying with a white man, then abandoned by that same man when frontier life proved too harsh for his civilized sensibilities and comfortable prejudices. She had died alone and largely unmourned, except by the few who remembered her kindness and wisdom, leaving behind a daughter who carried both the blessing and curse of mixed blood in a world that demanded complete loyalty to one side or the other, never both. The girl had her mother's proud bearing and unbroken spirit, combined with her white father's startling green eyes. A combination that marked her as belonging fully to neither world, but potentially carrying the strength and wisdom of both if she could survive long enough to claim that inheritance. Lena knelt in the mud with her spine straight and her chin raised in defiance, refusing to give her tormentors the satisfaction of seeing her break, even as blood trickled from her split lip and her hands were bound behind her back like a common criminal awaiting execution. Raven Elk urged his painted pony down the hillside, moving with the fluid silence of morning mist through the scattered boulders and stands of scrub oak that dotted the slope like ancient sentinels. His buckskin clothing was adorned with eagle feathers and traditional beadwork that marked him as a warrior of the old ways, someone who had earned his place through courage and skill in battle, rather than birth or political connections. The rifle across his back was a Winchester he had taken from a dead cavalry officer, while the tomahawk at his belt had been forged by his grandfather's hands and blessed by medicine men whose names were already becoming legend among his scattered people. If he was going to act to save Singing Bird's daughter, it would have to be soon, and the mood of the crowd was growing uglier, with each passing moment fed by Brand's inflammatory rhetoric, and their own desperate need to find someone to blame for tragedies that seemed to have no other rational explanation. In the town square below, the accusations were flying like stones from a sling, each one designed to inflame the crowd's anger and justify the violence that everyone knew was coming. Brand stood directly over Lena with his rifle pointed at her skull, his voice hoarse from shouting, and his face carved into harsh lines by the sleepless nights that had haunted him since Marcus died in his arms 3 weeks earlier. The man had aged 10 years in those 3 weeks, his formerly black hair now streaked with premature silver, and his aristocratic features hollowed out by grief and guilt that he refused to acknowledge or examine too closely. The expensive clothes he wore, imported wool and fine leather that cost more than most frontier families saw in a year, couldn't disguise the fact that something essential had died in him, along with his son, leaving behind a hollow shell filled with nothing but rage and the desperate need to make someone pay for his loss. "Confess your crimes, witch," he demanded, spittle flying from his lips to freeze in the bitter air before it could reach the ground. "Admit that you cursed our children with your devil's magic, and maybe the Lord Almighty will grant you a quick death instead of the slow burning that your sins truly deserve." Lena raised her chin and met his gaze without flinching, despite the terror that was clawing at her heart like some living thing trying to tear its way free from her chest. Blood from her split lip, mixed with the salt crystals that had formed on her face during the night. But her voice remained as steady as mountain granite when she replied, "I have never harmed anyone in this town, Mr. Brand. I have only tried to heal the sick using the knowledge that my mother taught me before she dyed willow bark for reducing fever, chamomile for easing stomach pain, echinacea for strengthening the body's natural defenses against disease. If using such remedies to help my neighbors makes me evil in your eyes, then perhaps your definition of evil needs to be examined more closely." Her words struck the assembled crowd like a match touched to gunpowder, igniting an explosion of rage and hatred that had been building for weeks like pressure in a steam boiler, with no release valve. Someone in the back ranks hurled a chunk of frozen mud that struck her shoulder with enough force to leave a bruise that would last for days, while another person threw a jagged stone that grazed her temple and sent fresh blood streaming down her cheek in bright crimson rivulets that steamed in the cold air. "Lies and blasphemy," shrieked Martha Caldwell, the shopkeeper's wife, whose twin daughters had died in the previous week's surge of fever cases that had struck the town like a plague sent by an angry god. "You poisoned them with your heathen potions. I saw you with my own eyes, gathering herbs in the sacred burial grounds where decent Christian folk fear to tread. Sarbidium cardsalpa the bahogarpimat. Those herbs grow everywhere on the prairie, Mrs. Caldwell." Lena replied, her voice carrying despite its quiet tone and the mob's growing anger. "Your daughters died because they did not receive proper medical treatment in time to save them, not because of anything I gave them. I treated their fever with willow bark tea and cool compresses to bring down their temperature, the same remedies that your own grandmother would have used in similar circumstances if she had been here to help them." Sheriff Abe Cullen stood at the edge of the mob, like a man caught between two worlds, his weathered face pale beneath its coating of frost, and his hands trembling with something that might have been fear-guilt or simple cold. At 45 years old, he had seen more than enough frontier violence to fill several lifetimes, but something about this particular scene was making his stomach churn with an unease that went far beyond mere squeamishness at the prospect of watching a young woman burn alive. He owed his position as sheriff to Brand's political influence and financial support, a fact that everyone in Bitter Creek knew, but politely ignored in the interests of maintaining some semblance of law and order on the frontier. The rancher controlled thousands of acres of prime grazing land, employed dozens of men who depended on his goodwill for their livelihoods, and had connections with territorial officials who could make or break a small-town sheriff's career with a few carefully chosen words in the right ears. Crossing Elias Brand meant professional suicide and quite possibly physical danger as well, since the man was known to hold grudges and had the resources to act on them in ways that would never be traced back to him officially. But watching a 16-year-old girl face execution for crimes she obviously had not committed was testing the limits of Cullen's moral flexibility and forcing him to confront questions about his own character that he had been avoiding for years. More than that, there was something eating at his conscience that went deeper than mere corruption or political expedience. His daughter Sarah had died just 3 weeks earlier, one of the first victims of the fever that was now terrorizing the community. 8 years old with bright blue eyes and a laugh that could light up a room, she had been the center of his world, and the reason he got up every morning to face another day on the unforgiving frontier. She had died in his arms, burning with fever that no medicine could touch, whispering his name with her last breath while he held her hand and promised her that everything would be all right. The memory of that moment, the weight of her small body growing still, the way her eyes lost their focus and stared at something he couldn't see, haunted his dreams and woke him in cold sweats that had nothing to do with Wyoming weather. "Miko, now, hold on, Elias." Cullen called out, his voice barely audible over the crowd's growing anger, but carrying just enough authority to make some of the nearer men turn their heads in his direction. "We cannot simply execute someone without proper evidence and legal procedure. If she is truly guilty of witchcraft and murder, we need proof that would stand up in a territorial court of law." Brand whirled on him with eyes that blazed like coals, fresh from a forged fury and madness warring for control of his aristocratic features. "Proof," he snarled, gesturing wildly at the assembled townspeople with his free hand while keeping his rifle trained on Lena's head. "What more proof do you need than the evidence of your own eyes? Half the children in this settlement are dead or dying, and it all started after she came back from gathering herbs in the places that our people have always considered sacred and forbidden to outsiders. What none of them knew, what only Brand himself fully understood in the deepest, most carefully hidden chambers of his guilty heart, was that the fever outbreak terrorizing Bitter Creek could have been contained easily and quickly if proper medical supplies had been available to treat the sick. For the past 6 months, Brand had been systematically hoarding medical supplies, food blankets, and other necessities in the abandoned Broken Arrow mine that lay 5 miles east of town, creating artificial shortages that allowed him to sell desperately needed goods to neighboring settlements at vastly inflated prices. The scheme was elegantly simple and devastatingly effective in its execution. Brand used his political connections and financial influence to intercept supply wagons bound for Bitter Creek, claiming that they had been delayed by unseasonable weather or lost to Indian raids. When concerned citizens inquired about missing shipments, the supplies were then secretly transported to the old silver mine, where they could be stored indefinitely in the dry tunnels and retrieved as needed for sale to other communities that were willing to pay premium prices for goods that were supposedly scarce throughout the territory. When the fever struck Bitter Creek with unusual virulence in the early winter, proper treatment had been impossible, because the medicines that could have contained the outbreak, quinine for reducing fever, laudanum for easing pain, and other essential drugs, were locked away in Brand's underground warehouse, rather than sitting on the shelves of the town's legitimate medical suppliers. Families had been forced to watch their children die in agony for lack of simple remedies that Brand possessed in abundance, but refused to release, fearing that doing so would expose his elaborate fraud to official scrutiny and destroy the wealth he had accumulated through systematic theft from his own neighbors. Even his own beloved son Marcus had died for lack of medicine that his father could have provided with a single word, a fact that was eating Brand alive from the inside and driving him steadily toward the edge of complete madness. The guilt was unbearable, a weight that pressed down on his chest like a stone slab, and made every breath an effort, but rather than face the truth of his own crimes and accept responsibility for his role in his son's death, Brand had chosen to deflect blame onto the most convenient scapegoat he could find, a friendless, half-blood girl with no family or political connections to protect her from his accusations. The psychological pressure of maintaining this deception while simultaneously grieving his preventable loss had pushed Brand to the very brink of sanity, creating a mental state where he genuinely believed, or had convinced himself to believe, that Lena's mixed heritage and knowledge of herbal medicine made her responsible for tragedies that he himself had caused through nothing more complicated than simple greed and the systematic exploitation of his neighbor's trust. As the confrontation in the town square reached its boiling point, 3 young Cheyenne warriors appeared at the edge of the gathered crowd, like ghosts emerging from the morning mist. Their faces were painted with traditional streaks of red and white clay that marked them as men on a war mission, while their weapons, steel-pointed lances, carved bows with arrows, fletched with eagle feathers, and knives taken from fallen enemies, identified them as seasoned fighters despite their apparent youth. They had ridden hard through the bitter night with urgent news for Raven Elk about his younger brother Little Fox, a promising warrior of only 14 summers, who had disappeared 3 days earlier while hunting near the river, where Brand's men regularly set traps for wolves to collect the territorial bounty on their pelts. The boy was skilled in woodcraft and should have returned to their winter camp by the previous evening at the latest, but there had been no sign of him, except for tracks in the mud that suggested he had been pursued by mounted men through the cattail marshes that bordered the water. The sight of armed Indians appearing suddenly at the edge of an already volatile situation sent a ripple of panic through the mob of townspeople, transforming their focused anger at Lena into a more diffuse terror that could explode in any direction without warning. Several men drew their weapons, while others grabbed burning brands from the nearby fire barrels, creating a bristling wall of flame and steel between themselves and the painted warriors. Women screamed and pulled their children behind them, while men who had never faced combat in their lives suddenly found themselves contemplating the possibility of dying in battle before the sun reached its zenith. The tension in the square ratcheted up to a breaking point that could shatter into wholesale violence at the slightest provocation, with both sides armed, angry, and convinced of their own righteousness. The morning mist that had provided some concealment earlier was lifting rapidly under the combined heat of torches and the press of so many warm bodies, revealing the full scope of the confrontation and eliminating any possibility of tactical retreat or concealment for either group. It was at that crucial moment, when the situation balanced on the knife's edge between controlled mob justice and chaotic battle that would leave dozens dead in the Wyoming snow, that Raven Elk emerged from the crystalline air like an avenging spirit given solid form and murderous purpose. He moved with purposeful stride directly into the heart of the mob, his appearance calculated to achieve maximum psychological impact on everyone present. Eagle feathers adorned his black hair in the traditional pattern of a war chief, while traditional war paint marked his weathered cheeks with symbols of power and protection that had been blessed by medicine men whose names were becoming legend among his scattered people. He carried himself with the confident bearing of a man who had faced death so many times that it held no terror for him whatsoever. If anything, death was an old friend who had walked beside him through countless battles and would welcome him with open arms when his time finally came. He walked through the crowd of armed and angry men as if they were children playing at war games, his dark eyes fixed unwaveringly on the kneeling girl with an intensity that made several of the nearest men step backward involuntarily. When he reached Lena's side, he stopped and extended his hand toward her in a gesture that was simultaneously protective and defiant, a direct challenge to every man in that square to do their worst if they dared. "And let her go," he said simply, his accented English carrying clearly across the square, despite its quiet, almost conversational tone. The crowd's response was immediate and violent. "Savage!" Someone screamed from the back ranks, the word torn from a throat, raw with cold and hatred. "Kill them both!" yelled another voice, high-pitched with hysteria and bloodlust that had been building for hours. "Drive the Red Devils back to the hell where they belong." A masked youth who looked no older than 18, one of Brand's younger ranch hands drunk on whiskey and the intoxicating power of mob mentality, stepped forward from the crowd and hurled a jagged piece of broken pottery with vicious force and deadly accuracy. The projectile struck Lena's mouth with a wet, meaty sound that carried clearly through the cold air, splitting her lower lip even wider and sending blood streaming down her chin in bright scarlet ribbons that steamed in the frigid air, like offerings to some primitive god of violence. She gasped in pain and shock, but maintained her upright posture, absolutely refusing to give her tormentors the satisfaction of seeing her collapse or beg for mercy that would never come. Her green eyes blazed with defiance, even as tears of pain mixed with the blood on her face. Something deadly and primal flickered in Raven Elk's dark eyes, like heat lightning illuminating a summer storm. But his expression remained as impassive as carved stone. He continued forward until he stood directly beside Lena, close enough to shield her with his own body if the situation deteriorated any further. The gesture was both an act of physical protection and a direct moral challenge to every man in that crowd, forcing them to confront the question of whether they were truly seeking justice or simply looking for an excuse to commit murder in the name of righteousness. Brand raised his rifle with hands that shook with a combination of rage, grief, and something that might have been fear, pointing the weapon directly at the warrior's broad chest, with his finger already tightening on the trigger. "You have no business here, savage." He snarled, his voice cracking with emotion that he could no longer entirely control. "This is white man's justice for white man's problems. Take your heathen friends and ride out of here while you still have the chance to do so with your scalps intact. Or this is no justice at all." Raven Elk replied, his voice as steady as mountain stone and twice as immovable. "This is fear and hatred, wearing the mask of righteousness and grief, seeking someone to blame for tragedies that it cannot accept or understand." His words cut through the morning air like a finely honed blade, exposing truths that the crowd did not want to hear, and forcing them to confront aspects of their own behavior that they preferred to keep hidden in the shadows of their consciousness. Several people shifted uncomfortably at his assessment, and Sheriff Cullen found himself nodding involuntarily in agreement before catching himself and forcing his expression back to official neutrality. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, with both sides posturing and making threats, while neither quite dared to strike the first blow that would transform the situation from tense confrontation to open warfare. But then Marcus Wheeler, the town's earnest young Methodist preacher, made a decision that changed everything in the space of a single heartbeat. Stepping forward from the crowd with a burning torch held high above his head, like the sword of a crusading knight, Wheeler's pale blue eyes blazed with the kind of righteous fury that had launched 1,000 holy wars throughout human history. His normally gentle voice cracked with strain as he competed against the crowd's noise, but his words carried the absolute conviction of a man who believed God was speaking through him. Let God's judgment be upon her. He shouted, drawing back his arm like a spear thrower preparing to strike. If she be innocent of these charges, let the flames pass her by unharmed. If she be guilty of consorting with the devil and bringing death to our children, let her burn as the Holy Scripture commands. He hurled the torch toward the wooden stake with all the force his lean body could muster. The flame traced an arc through the gray morning air like a falling star, and when it struck the dry timber, the result was immediate and terrifying. The wood caught fire, almost instantly flames racing up the stake's surface like living things hungry for destruction, and spreading to the surrounding grass and brush with frightening speed that spoke of tinder-dry conditions and wind that fed the growing conflagration. Within moments, fire was licking dangerously close to where Lena knelt in the heat and acrid smoke, making her cough violently, while tears streamed from her burning eyes and her lungs struggled to find clean air to breathe. Instead of backing away from the growing inferno in horror at what they had unleashed, several members of the mob pressed even closer to the flames, their faces glowing orange in the firelight, as they laughed and cheered with the savage joy of people who believed they were witnessing divine judgment made manifest in the physical world. They saw the flames as validation of their righteousness and proof that God Himself supported their cause, rather than recognizing the fire as evidence of their own capacity for monstrous cruelty. "Burn, witch!" Someone screamed over the roar of the rapidly spreading fire, their voice almost lost in the chaos of crackling flames and panicked human voices. Let hell claim its own spawn and cleanse our town of evil. The situation had passed far beyond mere intimidation and threats into the realm of immediate mortal danger for everyone present, not just the accused witch. The flames were spreading much faster than anyone had anticipated, fed by the bitter morning wind that was beginning to pick up strength and decades of accumulated debris around the town square that provided ready fuel for the growing inferno. Soon the entire center of Bitter Creek would be engulfed in an uncontrolled conflagration, trapping everyone innocent and guilty alike in a disaster of their own making. Raven Elk acted without a moment's hesitation, his warrior's instincts overriding all other considerations, as survival became the primary concern. Drawing his knife in one fluid motion that spoke of countless hours of practice and real combat experience, he slashed through the ropes binding Lena's hands just as the flames reached her kneeling position. The hemp parted with a sharp snap that was audible even over the noise of the fire, freeing her arms so she could protect her face as she rolled desperately away from the growing inferno that threatened to consume her alive. He hauled her to her feet with his free hand and began pushing through the crowd toward the edge of the square where escape might still be possible. But their path was immediately blocked by armed men who had anticipated such a move and positioned themselves accordingly to prevent any flight to safety. Pete Morse and 3 other ranch hands formed an impassable wall of rifles and grim determination, and their weapons trained on the fleeing pair with the deadly accuracy that came from years of hunting wild game and fighting hostile Indians. "Nobody leaves here breathing?" Morse snarled, his finger tightening on his trigger as he prepared to cut down both the girl and her defender with a single volley of gunfire. But even as he delivered the threat, His voice lacked the complete conviction that it should have carried, and something was clearly eating at his conscience, a memory that kept surfacing, despite his efforts to push it down. 5 years earlier, during an Apache raid on the town's outskirts that had left 3 men dead and a dozen buildings burned, Sheriff Cullen had saved Morse's life by throwing himself between the foreman and an arrow that would have pierced his heart. The sheriff had taken the projectile in his own shoulder, a wound that had taken months to heal, and left him with a permanent scar that served as a daily reminder of his courage and selflessness. That act of heroism had created a debt between the 2 men that transcended mere gratitude or professional obligation and the kind of blood bond that frontier men understood, even when they couldn't put it into words. Morse had carried the weight of that obligation for 5 years, and now he found himself in a position where honoring that debt might require him to betray his employer and quite possibly sacrifice his own life in the process. What happened next was pure chaos, erupting from multiple sources simultaneously, as if all the violence and fear that had been building in Bitter Creek for weeks suddenly reached critical mass and exploded outward in every direction at once like a bomb going off in the middle of a crowd. The young Cheyenne warriors, seeing their war leader threatened by superior numbers and hostile weapons, pushed through the mob with traditional war cries that echoed off the surrounding buildings like the voices of ancient spirits called back from the dead to witness this moment of crisis. Their weapons were ready for battle, and their painted faces showed no trace of fear or hesitation as they prepared to die fighting beside their chief. Someone in the crowd, whether one of Brand's men acting on orders or simply a panicked citizen reacting to the sight of charging Indians, fired a shot that may or may not have been aimed at any particular target. The sharp crack of the gunpowder explosion cut through the noise of flames and shouting like a knife through silk, and the result was immediate pandemonium, as everyone present suddenly realized that the situation had escalated beyond anyone's ability to control. The terrified horses that were tied to hitching posts around the square broke free from their restraints and charged directly through the center of the mob, and their iron-shod hooves striking sparks from the cobblestones as people dove in every direction to avoid being trampled beneath half a ton of panicked horseflesh. Screams of terror mixed with the whinnying of frightened animals and the roar of spreading flames to create a symphony of chaos that could be heard for miles across the Wyoming landscape. A small herd of cattle that had been penned near the square for slaughter the following day also broke loose when the gunfire spooked them beyond endurance, adding their panicked lowing to the cacophony of human screams, crackling flames, and gunfire that was rapidly transforming the center of Bitter Creek into something that resembled a battlefield more than a civilized town square. During this pandemonium, while everyone's attention was focused on the immediate threats of fire-stampeding animals and flying bullets, Tom Ridley slipped away from the main confrontation on orders that Brand had given him during their pre-dawn planning session. The foreman had been tasked with a specific mission that was separate from the public execution taking place in the square, a task that would provide Brand with crucial leverage in the next phase of his increasingly desperate plan. While the mob was distracted by the burning square and the battle between the townspeople and the Cheyenne warriors, Ridley made his way through back alleys and side streets toward Lena's cabin, where young Will lay helpless and alone, with nothing but his fever and delirium for protection. The journey took him past familiar buildings and faces neighbors who had known him for years, but who now looked at him with suspicion and fear as he moved with obvious purpose through streets that should have been empty given the excitement in the town center. The boy was barely conscious when Ridley kicked down the already damaged door and entered the small, cluttered room that had served as both home and medical clinic for the 2 orphan siblings. Will's face was flushed with fever that had climbed dangerously high during the morning hours, and his breathing was so shallow and labored that each breath seemed like it might be his last. His green eyes, so like his sister's, were unfocused and staring at things that existed only in his delirium. It was simple work for a man of Ridley's size and experience to wrap the sick child in blankets and carry him out to a horse that was waiting in the alley behind the cabin. then ride hard toward Brand's ranch, where the boy would serve as insurance against any interference with the final phase of their employer's plan. Will was too weak to resist, or even fully understand what was happening to him, which made the kidnapping both easier and more morally repugnant than Ridley had anticipated when he agreed to carry out Brand's orders. Back in the town square, the battle was expanding from a verbal confrontation into deadly physical violence that threatened to consume everyone present in its fury. Raven Elk grappled with two attackers simultaneously, his tomahawk finding its mark in one man's shoulder, while his knife parried a rifle thrust that would have opened his belly from sternum to pelvis if it had connected with flesh instead of steel. Ruth Banner tried desperately to reach safety through the chaos, but was knocked down by a panicked horse, her elderly body hitting the cobblestones with sickening force that left her dazed and possibly seriously injured. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead as she struggled to regain her footing, her medical supplies scattered around her like the remnants of a life spent in service to others. The fire continued to spread from building to building with frightening speed, as wind-carried sparks found ready fuel in wooden shingles and dried thatch that had been baked by months of unusually dry weather. Soon the entire center of Bitter Creek would be reduced to ashes unless the flames could be contained. But everyone was too busy fighting for their lives or fleeing in terror to organize any sort of effective fire suppression efforts. Sheriff Cullen found himself caught directly in the middle of escalating violence that threatened to destroy everything he had worked to build during his years of service to this frontier community. His conscience warred with his survival instincts as he watched injustice unfold before his eyes, knowing that any intervention on his part meant defying Brand and quite possibly signing his own death warrant in the process. The decision that would define the rest of his life was made for him when a stray bullet shattered the window of his office, sending glass flying in every direction and destroying something that he valued more than his own life. The bullet struck a framed photograph that sat on his desk, a picture of his daughter Sarah, 8 years old, and smiling at the camera with the innocent joy that only children can achieve, captured just weeks before she had been struck down by the fever that was terrorizing the community. Looking at her smiling face amid the broken glass and chaos, Cullen felt something break inside his chest that had nothing to do with physical injury. This was his moment of truth, to the crossroads where he would either find the courage to do what was right or spend the rest of his life knowing that he had failed when it mattered most. He drew his service revolver and fired 2 shots into the air, the sharp reports cutting through the noise of battle like commands from heaven itself. "Everybody stop." He bellowed his voice, carrying the full authority of 20 years in law enforcement and a lifetime of frontier experience. "This ends right now, or I'll arrest every last man jack of you for disturbing the peace, inciting a riot, and attempted murder." The fighting gradually died away as people began to realize that they were being confronted by legal authority, backed up by loaded weapons, and a man who had clearly decided that he was willing to use them. But the fire continued to burn unchecked, and the fundamental conflict that had brought them all to this point remained completely unresolved. Brand still commanded the loyalty of most of the townspeople through a combination of economic influence and carefully cultivated fear. And Lena was still facing accusations of crimes that carried a death sentence under territorial law. The brief respite gave Raven Elk time to assess their tactical situation and begin planning their next move with the cold calculation of a man who had survived countless battles through superior strategy rather than simple luck or divine intervention. They were outnumbered by at least 20-1, trapped in the middle of a hostile crowd with no clear escape route and cut off from any realistic hope of outside assistance. Worse still, the fire that they had initially hoped might provide cover for their flight was now threatening to consume them, along with everyone else in the square. But the warrior had faced hopeless odds before and emerged victorious through a combination of skill, courage, and the sort of desperate improvisation that separated survivors from victims in the harsh realities of frontier warfare. He caught Lena's eye and began communicating through subtle hand signals, a mixture of standard military gestures learned during his years fighting the cavalry and traditional Cheyenne hunting signs that allowed complex messages to be passed silently between members of a war party. As the crowd began to regroup and Brand started organizing his men for what everyone understood would be the final assault that would end this confrontation one way or another, Tom Ridley emerged from the smoke and confusion on horseback, like a messenger from hell itself. His weathered face was grim with purpose, and something that might have been guilt or simple nervousness. While across his saddle lay Will's limp form, the boy's face flushed with fever, and his breathing so shallow that it was barely visible, even at close range. "Boss says to tell you." Ridley called out his voice, carrying clearly across the damaged square, despite the noise of crackling flames and the moans of wounded men. "Bring the witch and her savage friend to the old Broken Arrow mine by sunset, or the kid dies slow and painful. Come alone, no tricks, no territorial law, just the three of you walking into justice like civilized folks ought to do." The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke from the dying fires, giving them until evening to make an impossible choice between surrender and almost certain death or refusal, and watching an innocent child pay the price for their defiance with his life. It was exactly the sort of moral trap that Brand excelled at creating, using the bonds of human compassion as weapons to force his enemies into positions where they had no good options, and every choice led to tragedy of one sort or another. But Ridley's appearance and manner of delivering the message also revealed something important about the nature of the opposition they were facing and the cracks that might be appearing in Brand's seemingly solid control over his subordinates. The man's hands shook as he held Will's unconscious form, and his eyes couldn't quite meet Lena's when he delivered Brand's ultimatum. Whatever else Tom Ridley might be, hired gun enforcer or simple ranch hand following orders, he was clearly not comfortable with the role of child murderer, and that discomfort might provide an opening for negotiation, escape, or even alliance if the situation could be managed correctly. The abandoned Broken Arrow mine lay 5 miles east of Bitter Creek, nestled in a narrow valley between two hills that provided natural concealment from prying eyes and unwanted interference. It was a played-out silver claim that had been shuttered nearly 8 years earlier when the ore ran thin, and the mining company went bankrupt, leaving behind only empty tunnels, rotting support timbers, and a partially collapsed entrance that made the whole site look more like a natural cave than a man-made excavation. The mine's remote location and dangerous condition made it an ideal place for Brand to conclude his deadly charade without interference from territorial authorities or unwelcome witnesses who might complicate his carefully constructed narrative of frontier justice. What Lena Raven Elk, Sheriff Cullen, and the others didn't know, what only Brand and his most trusted lieutenants understood, was that the supposedly abandoned mine had been serving as Brand's personal warehouse for the past 6 months. The hoarding operation was vast in scope and devastating in its impact on the community. Room after room in the underground complex was filled with wooden crates containing all the medical supplies, food blankets, and other necessities that he had been systematically diverting from Bitter Creek's legitimate supply chains. The fever outbreak that was terrorizing the town could have been contained within days if the proper medicines had been sitting on the shelves of local suppliers rather than locked away in Brand's secret warehouse. But his greed and his fear of exposure had prevented him from releasing even a fraction of the supplies that could have made the difference between life and death for dozens of families. Sheriff Cullen approached the small group as they prepared for what might well be their final mission, his face etched with the kind of resolve that comes from a man who has finally decided to stop compromising his principles. Despite his injured reputation and well-known corruption, despite the fact that accompanying them meant certain death if they were captured, he announced his intention to join their desperate gamble. "I'm coming with you," he said quietly, checking his service revolver's ammunition and making sure that his badge was prominently displayed on his coat where everyone could see it. "This may not have started as my fight, but it's become my responsibility, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let more innocents die because I was too much of a coward to do what's right when it mattered most. This isn't your fight, lawman. Raven Elk replied, his tone respectful but firm. Brand owns you, and everyone in this town knows it. Why risk your life for strangers who can do nothing to advance your career or protect your position when the territorial authorities come asking questions? Cullen was quiet for a long moment, staring at the damaged buildings around them, as if seeing them clearly for the first time in years. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom and bitter regret that could only come from a man who had compromised his principles once too often, and finally found the courage to make a stand. Because my daughter Sarah died 3 weeks ago, he said quietly, his words barely audible over the crackling of dying flames and the moans of wounded men. 8 years old, sweetest little girl you ever saw, smart as a whip, and kind to everyone she met, regardless of their station in life. She caught the fever early in the outbreak, and there was no medicine available to treat her properly, no supplies to keep her comfortable while she burned up from the inside like a piece of wood in a fireplace. He paused, struggling with emotions that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained professional demeanor. I held her hand while she died, and I couldn't do a damn thing to help her, except watch and pray for God to take her quickly, so her suffering would end. But if Brand has been hoarding medical supplies, like I'm beginning to suspect, then Sarah didn't have to die the way she did. None of those children had to suffer and die for lack of simple medicines that should have been available to every family in this community, regardless of their ability to pay premium prices. The confession revealed the full depth of corruption that had infected Bitter Creek's leadership, but it also demonstrated that redemption was possible, even for those who had compromised their principles in service to political expediency and personal advancement. Cullen's guilt over his daughter's preventable death had finally overcome his fear of Brand's retribution, transforming him from a passive enabler of corruption into an active agent of justice, even if that transformation had come too late to save the child that he loved most in the world. As the afternoon shadows began lengthening across the damaged town square, and the smoke from the dying fires drifted away on the prairie wind, their unlikely alliance set out for the confrontation that would determine whether justice or corruption would ultimately triumph in the Wyoming territory. They walked in single file across the harsh landscape, alert for ambushes, but hoping to reach the mine before darkness made navigation impossible and gave Brand's men additional advantages in what was already a desperately uneven fight. The terrain they crossed was unforgiving, even by frontier standards. Rolling hills covered with sagebrush and punctuated by rocky outcroppings that could conceal armed men with soil so thin and rocky that it supported only the hardiest vegetation and provided little cover for anyone trying to move unseen across its surface. The wind carried the scent of approaching snow and the promise of another bitter night that could kill exposed travelers within hours, while overhead ravens and buzzards circled in lazy spirals like dark omens against the pale winter sky. During their march, Ruth Banner whispered urgently to Lena about her father's death 8 years prior, sharing suspicions that she had carried in silence for too long. James Grayhawk didn't die of pneumonia like everyone believed, she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. His symptoms were all wrong, and the fever pattern was different the way he wasted away, despite appearing strong just days before. There was something else, too. A strange smell about him in the hours before he died, like bitter almonds or some kind of poison. She pressed a small glass vial into Lena's trembling hand. I saved tissue samples from your father's body preserved in alcohol, according to methods I learned from a doctor in St. Louis years ago. I've been carrying them ever since, waiting for an opportunity to seek proper justice. If we can somehow get these to a qualified physician with the right equipment, they'll show traces of whatever really killed James Grayhawk. The revelation hit Lena like a physical blow, opening up possibilities she had never considered, and casting her father's death in an entirely new light. Are you saying he was murdered? I'm saying that Elias Brand visited your father 3 times in the weeks before he died. Ruth replied grimly. They were arguing about land ownership, valuable grazing acres with year-round water access that would be worth thousands of dollars to whoever controlled them. Your father had legal claim papers from the Territorial Land Office documents that proved his right to that property beyond any possible doubt. Then he died suddenly. Those papers disappeared. And within months, Brand was presenting forged documents showing that he had purchased the land legally from James Grayhawk before his death. Armed with this knowledge of Brand's potential crimes, stretching back nearly a decade, they approached the mine with a sense of purpose that went far beyond simple rescue or survival. They were not just fighting to save Will's life and clear Lena's name. They were seeking justice for murders and theft that had destroyed families and corrupted an entire community. Crimes that had gone unpunished for far too long because their victims had lacked the power or connections to demand accountability from those who had wronged them. The mine entrance was even more heavily fortified than they had expected when they finally came within sight of the valley. Guards were posted at strategic intervals behind improvised barriers that would provide excellent cover for defenders while exposing any attackers to devastating crossfire. Brand had obviously anticipated their arrival and prepared for a siege that could last for days, with supplies and ammunition stockpiled to sustain his men through a prolonged battle. Tom Ridley emerged from the mine's mouth as they approached within hailing distance, his face drawn with exhaustion and his hands shaking with what looked like the early stages of alcohol withdrawal or extreme nervous tension. He had been Brand's most trusted lieutenant for 5 years, carrying out orders without question and never allowing his conscience to interfere with his duties. But the events of recent weeks had tested his loyalty to the breaking point and forced him to confront aspects of his own character that he had been carefully avoiding for most of his adult life. "That's close enough," Ridley called out when they were still 50 yards from the mine entrance, his voice carrying clearly across the valley, but lacking the confidence and authority that it should have possessed. "Boss wants to parley with you before we settle this business once and for all. Says he's got terms that might be acceptable to all parties concerned if you're willing to be reasonable about things." Brand himself appeared a moment later, emerging from the mine's shadowy interior like some creature of darkness given human form for the specific purpose of spreading misery and destruction. His expensive clothes were now rumpled and stained with mine dust, his aristocratic features haggard with sleepless nights, and the accumulated weight of guilt that he refused to acknowledge or examine. Behind him came 2 more armed men, their rifles trained with deadly precision on the approaching party. "So you actually came," Brand said, his voice carrying a note of genuine surprise mixed with grim satisfaction at this confirmation of his psychological manipulation. "I must confess, I was not entirely certain that you would value the boy's life highly enough to walk willingly into what you must know is almost certainly a trap designed to eliminate all of you permanently. Where is Will?" Lena demanded, her young voice carrying an authority that seemed to surprise even her with its strength and directness. "What have you done to him, and what are your terms for his safe return?" "The child is safe enough for the moment," Brand replied with a cruel smile that revealed teeth stained yellow from years of tobacco use and poor dental hygiene. "Though I must warn you that his condition has been deteriorating steadily throughout the day, and he will require proper medical attention very soon if he is going to survive much longer. The question before us now is whether you are willing to trade your own lives for his, and whether we can come to some arrangement that serves everyone's interests without unnecessary bloodshed." It was at that moment that Sheriff Cullen made his move, stepping forward with his badge prominently displayed, and his service revolver held in a steady hand that showed no trace of the trembling that had afflicted him earlier in the day. Drawing upon 20 years of law enforcement experience, he projected authority and confidence that he did not entirely feel. But that was necessary if he was going to have any chance of success in the confrontation that was about to unfold. "Elias Brand," he announced in his most official voice, "you are under arrest for hoarding essential supplies during a medical emergency, contributing to the deaths of 8 children, kidnapping a minor child, and conspiracy to commit murder. You have the right to remain silent, though I doubt it will do you much good, considering the evidence we have against you." Bran's laughter was harsh and ugly, echoing off the rocky walls of the valley, like the cry of some predatory bird that fed on carrion and human misery. "You think that tin star means anything out here in the wilderness, Abe? You think territorial law carries any weight when we are miles from the nearest settlement and surrounded by men who answer only to me? You work for me. Remember, I bought that badge and everything that comes with it, and I can take it away any time I choose to do so." Maybe that was true once. Cullen agreed, his voice remaining steady despite the tremor of fear that was beginning to build in his chest. "But I found some very interesting papers in your office safe while you were busy playing vigilante in the town square this morning. Bills of sale for medical supplies that were supposedly lost in transit to mysterious buyers who were willing to pay premium prices. Warehouse receipts for goods that never reached our local stores, despite being paid for by the territorial government. Correspondence with corrupt officials who were willing to look the other way in exchange for a percentage of the profits." The sheriff produced a leather document folder from inside his coat, holding it up so that everyone present could see it clearly. "Everything is here in black and white, Elias. Names, dates, amounts, signatures, enough evidence to hang you for murder and corruption, even if we never find a single crate of the supplies you have been hoarding. The territorial authorities are going to be very interested in reading through these papers, especially the letters that document your dealings with officials in the capital who were supposed to be enforcing the laws you were breaking." Bran's face went white as bleached bone, then flushed deep red, with the kind of rage that comes from a guilty man confronted with irrefutable evidence of his crimes. The full implications of exposure were sinking in. His elaborate scheme was unraveling. His political connections would abandon him to save themselves. And his reputation would be destroyed even if he somehow managed to avoid the gallows. Worse still, the truth about his son's preventable death would become public knowledge, marking him forever as the kind of monster who would sacrifice his own child for profit and personal advancement. "You are bluffing," he snarled, but the uncertainty that flickered in his eyes was visible even at a distance. "You would never have dared to break into my private safe without a warrant, and even if you had, you would not be stupid enough to bring such evidence with you into a situation where you might be killed and the papers destroyed." Cullen opened the folder with deliberate ceremony and began reading from one of the documents in a clear, carrying voice that could be heard by every man present. Invoice dated September 15th, a shipment of quinine and laudanum, totaling 47 bottles sold to Laramie Settlement for 3 times the normal territorial price. Payment received in full goods, delivered personally by Thomas Ridley on the morning of September 18th. He looked up from the papers and fixed Brand with a stare that carried the full weight of his authority. "Your signature is on every page, Elias. Your handwriting, your personal seal, your crimes, documented in your own words for anyone who cares to examine the evidence." The revelation hit Tom Ridley like a physical blow, staggering him backward as the full scope of his employer's betrayal and his own unwitting complicity became clear for the first time. He had been the one carrying out Brand's orders, delivering supplies to distant buyers, while turning away from the desperate pleas of his own neighbors for medicines that could have saved their children's lives. The guilt that had been eating at him for weeks suddenly crystallized into something approaching madness, a psychological pressure that threatened to shatter his sanity entirely. "You bastard," Ridley whispered, his voice thick with horror and self-loathing as the weight of his actions finally became clear to him. "You made me complicit in murdering children. My own neighbors' kids, children I have watched grow up from babies into young people with hopes and dreams, and you turned me into their killer without me even knowing what I was doing." But there was something else happening in the shadows of the mine entrance, a development that none of the principal players in this drama had anticipated or prepared for. Pete Morse, Brand's other chief lieutenant, was having his own crisis of conscience as he listened to the evidence being presented and remembered events from his own past that were now taking on new and terrible significance. During the chaos at the town square earlier in the day, Morse had been struck by a memory that had been nagging at the edges of his consciousness for weeks without quite reaching the level of full awareness. 5 years earlier, during an Apache raid on Bitter Creek's outskirts that had left 3 men dead and a dozen buildings burned to the ground, Sheriff Cullen had saved Morse's life by taking an arrow that was meant for the foreman's heart. Cullen had thrown himself into the path of the deadly projectile, without hesitation suffering a wound that had taken months to heal properly, and left him with a permanent reminder of his courage in the form of a scar that ran from his shoulder to his elbow. That act of selfless bravery had created a debt between the 2 men that transcended mere gratitude or professional obligation in the unforgiving world of the frontier, where survival often depended on the willingness of neighbors to risk their own lives for each other. Such debts were considered sacred and could never be fully repaid. Morse had carried the weight of that obligation for 5 years, and now he found himself in a position where he might finally have the opportunity to honor it, even if doing so meant betraying his employer and quite possibly sacrificing his own life in the process. Brand tried to maintain control over the rapidly deteriorating situation, but the psychological pressure of exposure combined with his subordinates' obvious wavering was creating cracks in his carefully constructed facade of confidence and authority. "Tom Pete," he said, his voice carrying a note of desperation despite his efforts to project calm leadership. "You need to remember who has been loyal to you all these years, who has kept food on your tables and money in your pockets when other men were struggling just to survive on this godforsaken frontier. We can work through this situation if we stick together and present a united front against our enemies. Work through child murder." Ridley's voice rose to something approaching a scream, the words torn from his throat by emotions that had been building for weeks and could no longer be contained. "Work through letting babies die in agony while we sold their medicine to strangers for profit. There ain't no working through that kind of evil, boss. There ain't no making peace with the devil once you have looked him in the eye and shaken his hand." Brand's response to his subordinate's breakdown was swift and merciless, demonstrating the kind of calculated brutality that had allowed him to build his empire in the first place. Drawing his pistol in one smooth motion that spoke of years of practice and familiarity with violence, he put a bullet through Jake Santos's chest at point-blank range when the man made the mistake of nodding in agreement with Ridley's condemnation. Santos collapsed without making a sound, blood spreading across his shirt in a pattern that steamed in the cold air, his life ebbing away in the Wyoming dust, while his killer watched with cold satisfaction. The casual murder was meant to serve as both punishment and warning to anyone else who might be considering rebellion against Brand's authority. Anyone else have something they want to get off their chest? Brand asked his smoking weapon, now trained on Pete Morse, with the kind of steady precision that comes from a man who has killed before and feels no moral qualms about doing so again. Anyone else want to question my leadership or my methods? But the casual murder of a loyal subordinate proved to be the final straw that broke Tom Ridley's remaining loyalty to his employer and pushed him past the point where rational thought could compete with righteous fury. With a roar of rage and self-loathing that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul, he turned his rifle on Brand and squeezed the trigger just as his former boss dove frantically for cover behind a pile of mining equipment. The shot went wild, the bullet whining off into the gathering dusk without finding its intended target. But it served as the signal for the beginning of a firefight that would determine the fate of everyone present in that narrow valley. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as Brand's remaining men opened fire on both the approaching party and their own rebellious colleague, creating a chaotic battle where it became impossible to tell friend from enemy in the smoke and confusion. But Pete Morse, faced with the choice between loyalty to his employer and the debt he owed to the man who had saved his life, made a decision that would define the rest of his existence. Instead of supporting Brand as he had been trained to do for years, he turned his rifle on his fellow guards and began systematically eliminating them with the cold precision of a professional killer who had finally found a cause worth dying for. In the chaos that followed, several crucial developments occurred almost simultaneously, each one contributing to a rapidly shifting tactical situation that would determine the ultimate outcome of this frontier drama. Raven Elk, moving with the fluid grace of a natural predator, began working his way around the flanks of Brand's position to approach the mine entrance from an unexpected direction. Lena, drawing upon knowledge of the local terrain that she had acquired through years of gathering medicinal herbs in the surrounding hills, found a position among the rocks that provided both cover and a clear field of fire for the rifle she had inherited from her father years earlier. Most importantly, for the immediate situation, Tom Ridley managed to fight his way through the defensive perimeter and into the mine itself, driven by a determination to rescue the boy, whose plight had finally awakened his long-dormant conscience and given him a cause worth risking his life to serve. The battle raged for nearly 20 minutes, with gunfire echoing off the rocky walls of the valley, and smoke from weapons and torches creating a haze that limited visibility and made accurate shooting nearly impossible. When the dust finally settled and the last echoes of gunshots faded away, Brand found himself trapped deep in the mine with only one remaining ally, while his enemies controlled both the entrance and the high ground that surrounded the valley. Inside the mine, Tom Ridley was making discoveries that confirmed his worst fears about his employer's character and his own unwitting role in perpetrating crimes against his own community. Room after room was filled with wooden crates containing everything from medical supplies to preserved food, enough goods to sustain a small town through even the harshest winter imaginable. The sight of those carefully organized supplies drove Ridley into a fury that transcended mere anger and entered the realm of righteous wrath. Here was the medicine that could have saved his nephew Jimmy's life, the food that could have prevented the malnutrition that had weakened so many children before the fever struck them down, the blankets that could have kept families warm during the bitter nights when fuel was too expensive for poor families to afford. He found Will in a small side chamber that had been carved out of the rock years earlier to serve as a storage area for mining equipment. The boy was in worse condition than anyone had realized, his fever climbing to dangerous levels, and his breathing becoming increasingly labored as the illness ran its course unchecked by proper medical treatment. "Easy there, son," Ridley whispered as he cut the ropes that bound the child's hands and feet, his voice gentle, despite the violence that was raging elsewhere in the mine complex. "We are going to get you out of this place and back to your sister where you belong. She has been worried sick about you, and she is going to be mighty relieved to see that you are still breathing. But getting Will out of the mine alive would require more than simply carrying a sick child through dangerous tunnels. It would mean fighting past Brand and his remaining defender, while protecting someone who was too weak to move under his own power and too valuable to the enemy to be allowed to escape." The solution came from an unexpected source. Deep in the mine's main chamber, Ridley discovered Brand's private office, a surprisingly well-appointed room where the rancher had conducted his illegal business away from prying eyes and official scrutiny. More importantly, the office contained several oil lamps and enough combustible material in the form of papers and wooden furniture to create a significant fire that would force Brand's remaining men to evacuate or risk being trapped underground when the smoke became too thick to breathe. Ridley began methodically soaking papers and cloth in lamp oil, creating a trail of combustible material that would carry flames throughout the underground complex when ignited. The work was painstaking, but gradually he managed to create a network of fire that would spread quickly through the most important areas of the mine. Above ground, thick black smoke began pouring from the mine entrance, like some kind of supernatural fog. The acrid smell of burning wood and paper filled the valley, and then Ridley's voice echoed from the depths. "Fire in the hole." He emerged, carrying Will the boy, unconscious but breathing. but a rifle shot cracked across the valley. Brand had flanked through a secondary tunnel weapon trained on Ridley's back. The bullet took the foreman high in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing down, with Will still clutched in his arms. Despite the shattered shoulder blade and blood soaking his shirt, Ridley managed to shield the boy as he rolled behind cover. Pain was excruciating, but determination drove him forward. Brand emerged fully face-blackened clothes, torn but grip steady, as he drew bead on both Ridley and child. His mind had snapped completely under pressure. He was no longer entirely human, reduced to something driven by pure survival instinct and need for revenge. "End of the line for all of you," he snarled. But salvation came from 30 yards away. Lena, positioned on a rocky ledge, put a bullet through Brand's gun hand with precision earned through years of hunting. The weapon flew from nerveless fingers as he screamed and clutched shattered bones. "That's for Will," she called out. "And for my father and all the children who died for your greed." Brand collapsed to his knees, empire crumbling as fire consumed his hoarded wealth and criminal records. But as he knelt in Wyoming dust, something snapped completely in his mind. Looking up with inhuman eyes, he began laughing high-pitched, hysterical laughter that spoke of complete madness. "You want to know about your father, half-breed?" He gasped through his insane laughter. Ruth stepped forward with her vial of tissue samples. "We already know, Elias. I have evidence of arsenic poisoning." Brand's laughter grew more maniacal. "Arsenic? You think I was that patient, that subtle, I put a bullet in his back while he was checking fence lines on what should have been my land by right of superior strength and intelligence? Made it look like Indian raiders had killed him, burned his horse, and scattered some arrows around to complete the deception. Nobody questioned the story because they wanted to believe it. The confession hit everyone like a thunderbolt. Brand had murdered James Grayhawk for his land, then spent 8 years growing rich on stolen property, while Lena struggled as an orphan. The land was legally his. Lena said, voice deadly quiet. "Papers I burned along with his cabin after I made sure his half-breed wife and bastard daughter weren't inside to witness the destruction." Brand replied. "I forged new documents showing I'd bought the land fair and square from James Grayhawk before his untimely death." But Brand wasn't finished with his confessions. Complete madness had unleashed years of festering guilt. "Your precious mother knew I'd killed her husband. I visited her before she died, told her exactly what I'd done, and how I was going to take everything that had belonged to your family. She died knowing her half-breed daughter would grow up with nothing, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do to stop it." The casual cruelty was final proof Brand had passed beyond ordinary evil into something monstrous. Raven Elk stepped forward, tomahawk ready, dark eyes blazing with controlled fury. "You will pay for those words in blood." "Wait," Lena said with surprising authority. "Let territorial justice handle his punishment. Hanging's too quick and clean for what he's done, but a lifetime spent breaking rocks in a territorial prison might teach him something about the value of human suffering." It was a moment that defined her character, choosing justice over revenge, mercy over brutality. Even when facing the man who had destroyed her family and tried to destroy her own life through systematic lies and manipulation. As smoke continued rising from the ruined mine and Brand was finally led away in chains, the survivors began tending to the wounded and assessing the full scope of the evidence that had been uncovered. Tom Ridley, his shoulder roughly bandaged to stop the worst of the bleeding, knelt beside Will's unconscious form and whispered apologies that could never truly atone for his role in the tragedy. The journey back to Bitter Creek took place under a canopy of stars that seemed brighter than usual, as if the Wyoming sky itself was celebrating the triumph of justice over corruption. Will's fever had broken during the ride, and though he remained weak and disoriented, Ruth Banner pronounced him to be out of immediate danger for the first time in weeks. The town they returned to was fundamentally different from the one they had left that morning, changed not just by the physical damage caused by fire and fighting, but by a deeper transformation in the collective spirit of the community. The people of Bitter Creek had been forced to confront the darkest aspects of their own nature and witness the consequences of allowing fear and prejudice to override basic principles of justice and human compassion. Some would never change, would never acknowledge their role in nearly murdering an innocent girl, or their complicity in allowing systematic corruption to flourish unchecked. But many others had learned lessons that would make them better neighbors, better citizens, and better human beings for the rest of their lives. Lena Grayhawk walked through the damaged streets with her head held high, no longer the accused witch who had knelt in the mud before an angry mob, but a young woman who had proven her courage and integrity in the crucible of frontier justice. Her mixed heritage was now revealed as a source of strength, combining her mother's wisdom with her father's determination to create something new and powerful. The abandoned mine was sealed permanently after investigators finished cataloging the evidence found in its depths, but not before a memorial was erected to honor the 8 children who had died unnecessarily during the fever outbreak. Their names were carved in granite imported from the territorial capital, ensuring that future generations would remember the true cost of corruption. As winter yielded to spring and spring to summer, Bitter Creek transformed itself from a community divided by fear and prejudice into something that more closely resembled the democratic ideals that had drawn so many people to the American frontier. It wasn't perfect, no human community ever could be, but it was measurably better than it had been before the crisis, and it continued to improve with each passing season. 6 months after Brand's territorial execution, Lena stood on the hill overlooking town as spring transformed the Wyoming landscape from frozen wasteland to green promise. She was no longer the frightened girl who had knelt in icy slush before an angry mob, but a confident young woman who had helped reshape her world through courage, compassion, and unwavering commitment to justice. Raven Elk had returned to his people, but maintained regular contact with the town, serving as an unofficial ambassador between the Cheyenne Nation and the white settlers. Little Fox found safe after hiding from Brand's men often accompanied trading parties that conducted peaceful business in Bitter Creek's markets. Sheriff Cullen had proven himself worthy of the redemption he had sought, using his restored authority to protect the innocent and uphold the law with dedication that honored his daughter's memory. Tom Ridley, his shoulder permanently damaged, but his conscience finally clear, had become one of Cullen's most trusted deputies. Ruth Banner continued to serve as Bitter Creek's senior medical practitioner while training Lena as her successor. The girl who had been accused of witchcraft had become the territory's most respected healer, sought out by families from settlements hundreds of miles away. As church bells rang across the prairie that bright spring morning, Lena walked toward the sound with Will beside her, healthy, strong, no longer the sickly boy who had nearly died as a pawn in Brand's cruel game. They were true family now, bound by shared hardship and mutual love. The sermon was delivered by Pastor Wheeler, his own prejudices tempered by witnessing the consequences of his actions. He spoke of forgiveness and redemption, of understanding between peoples, of every citizen's responsibility to ensure such injustices never occurred again. Ridley sat quietly in back, still wrestling with guilt, but working toward redemption through honest labor. New administrators had cleaned up Brand's criminal network, but the real work of rebuilding was being done by ordinary people who had decided to demand better from themselves and their leaders. As the service concluded and congregation filed into bright sunshine, there was hope in the air that had been missing from Bitter Creek for too long. Children played together, regardless of heritage. Adults conducted business with civility and respect, and the future seemed bright with promise. Lena walked home through streets that no longer felt hostile, past buildings that had been repaired and improved since that terrible winter's violence. She was no longer running from false accusations or trying to prove innocence of crimes never committed. Instead, she moved confidently toward a future she would help create through healing skills, moral courage, and commitment to justice taking root throughout the Wyoming territory. That evening, as sunset painted the prairie in gold and crimson, Lena stood on her front porch with Will beside her, watching lights come on in Bitter Creek's windows. Each light represented a family, a story, a life that had been touched and shaped by the past year's events and the choices everyone had made together during their community's greatest trial. Some choices had been wrong, driven by fear and prejudice rather than wisdom and compassion. But others had been absolutely right, inspired by courage and love, and the fundamental belief that justice was worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost involved. It was those right choices that would define Bitter Creek's future and ensure that the lessons learned during those dark days would never be forgotten by the generations that would follow. As stars emerged overhead, twinkling like diamonds scattered across black velvet, all was peaceful in the frontier town. The witch hunt was finally over. Justice had ultimately prevailed, and tomorrow would bring new opportunities to build upon the foundation of understanding and cooperation that had been laid through blood sacrifice and the unwavering moral courage of people who had chosen to do what was right when doing wrong. Would have been so much easier and safer. The half-blood girl who had been called a witch had become a beacon of hope in the wilderness, proving that even in the darkest times, truth and compassion could triumph over hatred and corruption. Her story would echo through generations, a testament to the power of courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and the possibility of redemption for all who were brave enough to choose what was right over what was convenient.